And we're off. Well, today's lesson number 1, ownership and property. If this is not your first lesson, don't trip about it because you can start with any one of them. But there are a lot of people who just like to start with number 1, right? Because that sort of feels comforting. So we're going to talk about ownership and property. And when we talk about the subject of property, we're going to be talking about what is owned. Then we're going to talk about how it's owned and how long it's owned and a whole bunch of other fascinating subjects. The concept of ownership is sort of a basic idea. All right, what's the second word a child learns? Mine. Isn't that right? Right? And the first one is usually mama, but after that it's mine. Sometimes that's the first word. So the idea of what is mine as opposed to what is yours is a fairly basic concept. One of the things we're going to talk about is not everything can be owned. You understand, I could own this building, but and the chairs in the building and all of that sort of stuff, but I don't own the air. All right, the air that's in the building is a fugitive substance. It's a migratory substance. It moves around. Could I own air? Can you capture air and own it? Well, if you've ever been to the gas station and put quarters in the machine to get air out, right, you know that you can own air if it's captured. They sell it for your tires. They sell air to scuba divers, right? You know, so it is possible to buy air, but normally in its natural state, air is not subject to ownership. Land, I can own the land, but what about the wild animals on the land, the squirrels and the birds that are running around? I don't own them because, like the air, they're fugitive, they're migratory substances, they move around. If I catch them, if I catch all the squirrels and birds and I put them in little cages, that's kind of weird, but anyhow, if I did that, if I captured them, I could own them, right? So do you understand, not everything can be owned. If you don't have the ability to prevent others from using it and don't have the rights to possess it, then you don't own it. So property, and what we're covering, for those of you that are new to this, we're covering what we know that the Bureau of Real Estate is interested in you knowing when you take the real estate licensing test. When I use the word property, many of us, I don't want to say most, I'm going to be judgmental, but many of us think of stuff. Right? My property, I'm probably thinking of my stuff. But legally, the word property does not refer to stuff, but it refers to rights that people have in stuff, right? You understand? It's rights or interest. And as we're going along, I might ask you to underline or circle a little bit just so to make sure you haven't fallen asleep and it's not too dark. You might underline rights or interest. Property is more than the thing. Property is rights and interests. The owner has, notice I've already highlighted this for you, a bundle of rights. And the bundle of rights includes the right to possess, to use, to sell, to enter, to give away, to lease, to encumber. That means to borrow money against it, to dispose, to exclude others, and to do nothing. All right, we're going to talk a little more about this bundle of rights, and when we talk about estates, which we're going to be talking about later tonight, there's different levels of ownership that people can have. And essentially the question we're asking, although it seems like an impolite question, is we would be asking somebody, how big is your bundle? You know, I mean, do you have a really big bundle? Do you have a small bundle? The size of your bundle determines the kind of ownership you have. These rights are not absolute. That's probably not a surprise. They're subject to government powers, right? There's the police power, which we'll talk about in another class, escheat, which is when the title reverts to the state. We'll talk about that in another class. Taxation, eminent domain, which sounds like a cheap champagne you get at 7-Eleven, right? But in fact refers to something completely different. We'll talk about that later. And in addition to the government rights impinging on your bundle, other people might have rights that impinge on your bundle as well. Easements, leases, trust deeds, etc. We're going to talk about all this, but not all tonight. So the bundle of rights, we call it that, like a bundle of sticks, a bundle of twigs, a bundle of straw. It's not an all or nothing thing. Like a bundle of sticks, they can be broken up. So if I own property, I could take the stick that's possession, and I could give it to a tenant. Somebody's paying me rent, I give them the possession stick. I could, you understand, I could convey interest, I could exclude people, I can break up the bundle. You need to know for the state exam that the bundle of rights is what defines ownership and property. So, property, it says that the owner may dispose of the whole bundle or any one at any time. And holding these rights to the exclusion of others defines ownership. Now, remember I talked about the squirrels in the air and all of that. Since I don't control them, I don't own them. And a related idea, which we're going to talk about in several of the subjects, is that if I can't or don't exclude others, I probably don't own it. This is not the legal technical way of putting it, but if I let other people use my stuff and treat it like their stuff, it's not my stuff anymore. Right? You understand? Just letting people use the stuff without any control over it could result in a loss of the stuff. Right? So if I can't exclude others from using it, I don't own it. All property is either personal property or real property. There's no third thing. There's no third kind. Not everything is property, but if it is property, it's either personal property or it's real property. Now, this chart is just sort of a little summary. You have real property and personal property, and they're one-word definitions. If people, over the years, people say to me, can you give me a one-word definition? And so if it was personal property, that one word would be movable. We're going to talk about that. And by movable, we mean movable by law. The one-word definition for real property, somebody suggested it was like their mother-in-law's mind, in that it was immovable. Right? Do you understand? If it's incapable of being moved by law, it's real property. And there are three things that comprise real property. There's land, there are fixtures, and there are appurtenances. And fixtures are attached, and appurtenances run with the land. That's a fun subject. We'll be getting to that later. So personal property, it's called a chose. I'm not mispronouncing it. We oftentimes say chattel. Originally, it was chattel. And personalty. And one of the fun things about going to real estate school is you get to learn a whole bunch of new words. And a lot of our words, most of our laws come from English common law, and a lot of English common law involves French stuff, right? I don't know if you, and the reason is because in the year 1066, William of Normandy, also known as William the Conqueror, a French guy, defeated the English army at the Battle of Hastings and became the King of England. And he did not speak English, he only spoke French. And his buddies only spoke French. And so we have French words in property law because he was French, right? And so chattel was originally a French word that meant personal property. We oftentimes say chattel. And if you're wondering, and I know some of you might be, the word cattle comes from that word, right? Because at the time, the King of England owned all real estate. So the only thing you could own if you weren't the king was personal property. And the only thing you had probably that was worth anything were your oxen. And so the word chattel and the word cattle sort of came together at that time. Personalty, you've heard the word realty. Some people find this a strange word. You've heard the word realty. That's real estate, right? Real property. Well, there's a similar word for personal property, and it's called personalty. Now, if you say he's got nice personality, you're not necessarily saying he's a nice person. He's got a nice car, right? You understand? That would be, so there's a joke there someplace, but I lost it too. So personalty refers to personal property, and chose is another Old English word that means a personal property right. It is generally movable. Mortgages, trust deeds, stock in syndicates are personal property. Now, the reason the Bureau of Real Estate throws that on the test is to hopefully confuse you, because a mortgage involves real property and trust deeds involve real property and stock and real estate syndicates involve real property, but those items are movable. They're not attached to the ownership of the land necessarily, right? And so they're personal property. We'll talk more about that. Personal property can be alienated. If you want, you can write in sold. The reality is the word alienate more nearly means conveyed, but that's a longer word to write in. So when you sell something, you've alienated it. That doesn't mean you made it angry at you, but here the word alien means like, well, like an alien, right? A stranger. So, and to alienate means that a stranger now owns the property. Hypothecated, that's a great word. It comes from two Greek words, hypo, which means under, like a hypodermic, goes under the skin, and thecate, which means to pledge or pawn. And if you want to write in a word, it means mortgaged. Mortgaged. The word mortgage and the word hypothecate means borrowing money against something without giving up possession of it. So hypothecated means mortgage and can sometimes become real property. Personal property can become real property, and real property can become personal property. I think I have an example. So this picture of timber growing trees, are those trees real property or personal property? Take a shot. This is the audience participation part.
Personal property.
Trees are personal. We got one vote for personal, one vote for real. Real. I'm going to go with the real property vote, because the trees are in the ground, right? You understand? If I buy the land, I would expect to get the trees. Isn't that right? So while it's growing, while they're in the ground, there are exceptions about nurseries. Every once in a while somebody does research. I hate Wikipedia, and they send me emails, right? Nursery trees are personal property. I understand that. Don't send me an email. But otherwise, trees that are growing are real property. All right, so I cut down the trees, and I pile the logs up. What do I have now? Personal property. And I build a log cabin out of the logs. Now what do I have? Real property. And then I get tired of the log cabin, and so I tear it apart to sell the wood for firewood. I now have personal property. How about this? And then the termites, I leave it sitting there, and the termites eat all the wood, and it becomes dust. And the dust would be real property, right? Dirt, sort of dust. Anyhow, I should have stopped when I was ahead. So do you understand? It's not, wood has nothing to do with it, right? It can be real, it can be personal, it can go back and forth. This causes trouble for real estate agents and others. Real property, because this is what we're really here to talk about, right? Realty, generally immovable, and notice I added by law, right? You'll see some examples of that. It includes land, fixtures, and appurtenances. On the state exam, they have specific questions. One is about a bearing wall. Now, for some of you that are wondering, that's a wall that they built between Alaska and Russia. That might not be right, by the way. That's called the Bering Strait. It has nothing to do with this. But what's a bearing wall? It bears the weight of the building, right? And so would you want to move it without thinking really hard about it? Probably not. So bearing walls would be an example of real property. They just like to ask that on the state exam. But leasehold estates, leases, are not real property. I just thought I would share that with you because those are two very common questions. We're going to discuss why as we go through. So let's talk about land. This seems like a simple subject. Dirt, I understand that. Dirt. So dirt is real property. That includes soil, rock, minerals, and oil and other substances. So minerals in the ground are real property, but when we've dug them up, they're personal property, right? Now, that seems simple. Mineral rights are automatically transferred. Now, they like to ask that question on the exam. If I buy and sell land, unless I exclude the right to go after minerals, they're included in the sale. Now, the way that would come up on a test question, or even if this ever came up in real life, is if I had a contract to buy the land, do I need a separate contract to buy the mineral rights? The answer is no, because the mineral rights are automatically transferred with the land. I don't need another agreement. They come with the land. Land can be divided vertically or horizontally. I'll talk about that in a minute. This is a gratuitous cartoon, I admit it. So that you see, he says that's what you get for not keeping the mineral rights. Anyhow, that's you have to. It was a slow day. Okay, never mind. Land can be divided vertically or horizontally. So if this is the surface of my land, and I've divided it into two parcels, that's a vertical subdivision. So I own land. I divide it into two parcels. I've divided it vertically because I've divided everything below it and everything above it. Could I sell air rights to someone, surface rights to someone, and subsurface rights to someone else? That's a horizontal subdivision. So you could break it up horizontally, you could break it up vertically. Both are subdivisions of some sort. And there we go, horizontal. The owner, now this gets a little bit, I don't know, stranger. This comes from English common law. And under English common law, if you own the surface of the land, you own everything below it. English common law said you own to the center of the earth, right? And not only do you own everything below your land, it's like an inverted pyramid because they figured out the world was round. So you owned all the way down to the center of the core of the earth. And English common law said you owned everything above your land to the edges of the universe. Right? Now, English, they were like that, right? They went around the world putting flags on stuff, right, and things like that. So that we still use that rule in California, right? If you own the surface of the land, you own what's below it, and you own what's above it, but not really to the edges of the universe, right? You can't tell NASA you don't want their satellites going through your airspace, right? You understand? Because they sort of cut you off at a certain point. But that's called the legal definition of land. And just so everybody understands the irony here, that airspace is considered land. Did that sink in? Right? The legal definition of land includes the space above the dirt. Right? That's a little bit more challenging. You have the right to lateral and subjacent support. We'll talk about that. Have water rights. You might have water rights, but the tough thing about water rights is they're usually not listed anywhere. They're not in title insurance policies. They're not mentioned in deeds. You can't look them up in county records. And your rights in all of this are not absolute. You probably knew that. Now, this is just a gratuitous graphic. Land, real estate, and real property. One way to look at it. Land, notice the inverted pyramid, subsurface, surface, and air rights are all part of the land. When you add physical improvements to it, like homes and things like that, we call that real estate. That could be. And real property, which is what we're talking about, includes not only the inverted pyramid and what's above it and the fixtures, it includes the bundle of rights, right? The things that are appurtenant, that are connected to the land. It'll make more sense, hopefully, later. Lateral and subjacent support. So what this is saying, so we have A and B who are neighbors, and C owns just the surface part. So C has like a little farm and a house on it, and B owns what's underneath, and A owns what's the side. Lateral means to the side. So what lateral support means is A is not allowed to chisel away at the side of the property if it causes B and C's land to slide, right? Do you understand? If you own property, you have a right to keep your neighbors from eating away at the edges if it makes your land slide out. It's lateral support. Also, B is not allowed to dig a big hole here if it causes the top of it to collapse. Lateral and subjacent support mean if you own land, you have the right to be supported on the sides and you have the right to be supported underneath. People can't cause your land to collapse, nor can they cause it to fall away. Lateral and subjacent support, more than you ever wanted to know about that. Water. Water in a river. Yes, question first.
I thought that if you own the land on the surface, you also own the land on the, underneath.
The question for those of you online is, if you own the land on the surface, don't you own the land underneath? But remember, a previous slide said that you could sell it in horizontal layers, right? So remember, you could sell air rights, surface rights, and subsurface rights. In that case, B had subsurface rights. So you don't always own what's underneath or above. You might have sold it. Christian.
Anybody that you know have ever sold air rights?
Yes, the question for those of you online is, anybody ever sold air rights? And the answer is yes. I used to work with a company up in San Francisco, and we'd put in this, I didn't personally put it in, but they put in this large office building, and at the top were expensive condominiums. And what the problem in San Francisco, some of you are, okay, I'm the only one old enough to remember, but there used to be this restaurant in San Francisco, and it rotated around, right? So if you sat in the restaurant, you could, see the whole city. Well, what happened is that as you go around, all you see now are the sides of buildings, right? Because they built up. So what this company did when they built these condominiums is they went to all the people between them and the bay, and they bought the airspace above their property so that people couldn't build up into that airspace, therefore preserving the view of the bay for as long as they wanted to.
How do you find value on that?
Well, they got it cheap because the people that were down there didn't think that, somebody said, I'll give you $100,000 for the airspace above you. And they said, sure. But I'm not sure how they offered them enough money that they accepted it.
What about the
Right.
daylight plane issue?
Well, pardon me?
About the daylight plane issue?
The daylight plane issue. You have, send me an email. Sorry about that. Moving forward, water in the river. Water, look in the diagram. Let's say I'm A and there's water in the river next to me. Is that water real property or personal property? Real? Anybody want to vote personal? Does the water move? Is it moving? It's a trick question, I have to admit. The real question should be, is it property? Or is the water in a flowing river more like the air or the wild animals, a migratory, fugitive, moving substance, and do you understand the water is not property? Water rights are. Do you understand the difference between the two? Fish in the ocean aren't property, but fishing rights are. You see the difference between the two, right? The fishing rights are property, but the fish aren't. You got to catch them, right, before you can own them. So well, let's talk about this. Riparian, the word riparian comes from the Latin word ripa, which refers to river. And we'll talk more about riparian and the other kind of rights, but it's the right of a landowner to the reasonable and appropriate use of water from its streams. So can A take water out of that river? Do you think A can take water out of the river?
Yes.
How about all the water? Probably not. Half of it? You're not sure, right? So the water, the California State Water Resources Code says that the water in flowing rivers in California belongs to the people of the state of California. And you have to use it reasonably and appropriately defined by the State Water Resources Board, right? So you can take some of the water, you can't take all of the water. How about B? Does B have any rights to the water? Yeah. Is he next to the water? Or he still gets to the water? Well, could B have rights to the water? And the answer is he could have rights to the water, because B's argument is going to be, I'm people, I'm in the state of California, and the water belonged to who? Who did we say it belongs to? The people of the state of California. Now, could A say, well, that's cool, you can have all the water you want, just don't come across my land to get it? Right? Your cows, as long as your cows stay on your side of the fence, they can have all the water they want. Do you think in the western United States wars were literally fought over this very arrangement? that people actually shot guns at each other because one guy owned the land around the river and wasn't letting other people get to it, right? And so the state can, this is called appropriation, they called it other things, but can give non-riparian owners the right to use the land. So riparian rights can be severed from the land by condemnation or prescription. Condemnation means the government takes it, and prescription means that other people have taken over the water rights. It's just a question. So littoral, the word riparian, you need to know, involves flowing rivers, flowing water courses. Now, one way to remember this is the word riparian begins with the letter R, as does the word river. Riparian rivers. Littoral is another Latin word that refers to the shore. The right of a landowner to reasonable and appropriate use of water from a lake. That might help us. Littoral begins with an L, like a lake. Sea or ocean. So rivers that flow next to you have a different action than tidal waters. So I remember reading this National Geographic article about there was a ship in England built hundreds of years ago called the Rose, and it barely made it out of the London harbor before it was a storm and it capsized and went down. So at that time, because most ships were made of wood, the King of England decreed that everything from high tide down to where the water was belonged to the king. So if a boat capsized and stuff washed up on the beach, all the peasants couldn't be running down to the beach to grab stuff because anything that was on the beach belonged to the king. So you understand the concept is that you really can't own a beach in California. We have the same rule. Right now you agree, well, what about the guy up in San Rafael who has the beach and he doesn't own the beach, he owns the land around it. Do you understand the sovereign, the state of California owns the beach, right? You own down to the mean high tide mark, you don't own any further. So you can control your land under some cases, but if somebody were to swim there, scuba there, boat there, parasail there, you can't kick them off because you don't own the beach, right? If you own next to a river, your rights, we'll talk about that, are a little different. Appropriation is when the state gives permission to a non-riparian owner to take water. And surface waters, you can build a dike to protect the land from flooding, but you cannot dig a trench to divert it. You can dike, but you can't divert onto somebody else's property or you'll be liable for damage. I have a really bad animation coming up. Really bad animation. So, really bad animation. All right. So A, notice A has a river that runs through his land. How far does A own? Does he own down to the high water mark of the river? Does he own down to where the water is? Does he own to the middle of the stream? High water mark, water, middle of the stream. Anybody want to take a guess? High water mark, water, middle of the stream. How many of you are not going to vote no matter what I do? All right, so that's good. I got a lot more votes that time. Usually I get a lot of people that vote for the middle of the stream, right? A bunch of middle of the stream people. But the problem with the middle of the stream idea is, what if that was the Mississippi River? And I bought land on both sides of the Mississippi, and if I owned to the middle of the river, then I could build like a toll booth, right, on the Mississippi, and charge people money for going up and down. How many toll booths would there be on the Mississippi if you could do stuff like that, right? There'd be like every 50 feet, there'd be another one. Isn't that how it works? So if the water is capable of commercial navigation, you own down to where the water is. You don't own the river, right, because the river belongs to the people of California. All right. So riparian is a flowing stream or river. Flood waters, you can dike, but you can't divert. In other words, you can't aim the river at your neighbor's house because it floods every often, right? You know, you say he wants water. He's been that guy, remember, he's been whining about water. This year, we're giving him water, right? You know, you can't do that. A lake, you can own a lake in California, but you can't own a river. Right? If the river is flowing across boundary lines, you don't own the river. Right? The state sort of owns the river. But a lake, you could own a lake, right? As long as it was all self-contained. Littoral is the lake, sea, or ocean you own to the mean high tide, not down to where the water is. And an appropriator is somebody who has the right to take water who doesn't actually live on the bank of the river. All right, this little chart, although it looks ugly, covers a lot of things on the test. A water table, is that like a water bed? I remember those. Remember, no one's here old enough to remember water beds. It actually has nothing to do with that. But a water table is that water is generally found in horizontal layers, right, between geologic strata, and that's what they call it. How far down do you have to go to hit the water table? Land is deeded to the mean high tide in tidal areas. I've already talked that. Underground waters that are just there are called percolating, like Mr. Coffee, right? Percolates. You put the coffee in the hot water, goes through the ground, right? So water that goes through the ground is said to be percolating. We'll talk about the importance of that when we get to the subject of septic tanks. And flood hazards are classified as frequent when flooding occurs on average more than once in a 10-year period, or 2 or more times in 10 years. And yes, the Bureau of Real Estate asks that. I'm just telling you that I know that recently on the test, they have asked what is a frequent flood hazard defined as, and the easiest way to remember it is 2 or more times in a 10-year period. If it floods 2 or more times in a 10-year period, it's considered to be frequent. Just a piece of trivia that you might need when you take the test. So we've covered part 1 of what is real property. Real property is land, right? And land includes everything below it, everything above it, and water rights, right? And mineral rights and some other rights that go with it. We've come to number 2 that constitutes real property: fixtures, which are things that are attached to the land, and we have hit on something that real estate agents actually sort of need to know. Right now, you may be thinking, do you mean everything you've said so far we don't really need to know? Well, you might live without riparian rights, selling real estate in Santa Clara County, right? You might, but this will come up more often. Now, I'll give you a quick example. Many years ago, I sold a house, and the buyer moves in, and the buyer calls me up and he says, there's no hot water. And I said, well, you got to wait a little bit. It takes a little while to switch all the utilities, turn things on. And he said, no, we've looked. There's no hot water heater. And so I called the seller up who had moved away, and I said, how you doing? How was the move? How do you like Texas? Okay, good. By the way, the hot water heater, you didn't take that with you, did you? And the guy said, well, yeah, we bought a brand new home and it didn't have one, and that one we just bought like 6 months ago. It was, and so we took it. Now guess who bought the buyer a hot water heater? Anybody want to take a wild guess? I ended up buying a hot water heater to make the buyer happy. So I believe if you stood outside a Home Depot looking for people coming out with fireplace screens and chandeliers, right? Some of them will be wearing suits, by the way. And you stop them and say, what do you do for a living? You're going to hear real estate agent come up more often than our percentage of the population. Do you understand the problem here? Right? Somebody buys a house, they move in, and stuff's gone. Right? What happened to this? What happened to the Tiffany chandelier? What happened to this? Right? So those are fixtures, right? This comes up often. So the general definition of fixtures is it can be attached by roots, plants, like remember the trees, vegetation, that would be fixed. Growing attached by roots is fixed. Embedded in it is fixed. Permanently resting on it. Some things are so big and heavy you don't have to bolt them down. Right? You understand? If it's big enough and heavy enough, it's affixed even though you didn't bolt it down. Permanently attached to a building is a fixture. And another definition is that a fixture are items that were at one time personal property but are no longer personal property because physically or legally, this will be interesting, they are now attached to the land. Screens, Venetian blinds, wall beds, there's a whole bunch of stuff that people take with them when they move. And I highlighted the bottom bullet because this is the way the Bureau of Real Estate most often asks the question. They are incorporated into the land and are now considered to be real property. Fixtures, because of their attachment and other issues, are now incorporated and part of the real property. So what makes something a fixture or not? There are 5 tests. We have a memory gimmick to help you remember. By the way, on the state exam, they often have a question about what are the 5 tests of a fixture. They often have a question. Now, Maria, right, is somewhat easy to remember, right? M-A-R-I-A. By the way, the real, if you're going to put it in the order of importance, it would be reversed. It would be Aram, right? But I don't know what that means, so I went with Maria. Method of attachment is the least important test, but what real estate agents consider to be the most important test. Adaptability of an item is a test because if it was custom built to be used on a particular parcel, then it's probably supposed to stay there. The relationship of the parties is a test. Between buyers and sellers, the court is on the side of the buyer because the buyer buys what the buyer sees. And if the seller wasn't planning to sell everything, they're supposed to put those little stickers, like you've been to a new home subdivision at the models and you see something that looks really nice, and there's a little sticker on it, you go look at it and it says, "You don't get this," right? Isn't that what it says? Something like that, right? And then you see something else that looks really nice and it's got a sticker and it says, "Don't even think that you're getting this," right? You understand? Not included in sale, right? So shouldn't the seller put little signs up and say, "You don't get it, you don't get this, you don't get that"? But if they don't do that and the buyer sees it, the buyer might want to get it. The intention of the person attaching it. Now notice that's the second to the most important test. The most important test is the agreement of the parties. Let me give you an example. I have a house, let's say it's an old Victorian, downtown San Jose. I've jacked it up off the foundation, all right, high enough that we can put wooden blocks under it. It is no longer attached to the foundation. Is that house real or personal property? While it's jacked up off the foundation, real or personal property? Real? It depends, somebody says. I'll go with it depends. It depends on why I jacked it up. If I jacked it up off the foundation because I'm selling it, right? I want the land and some guy down the street has a vacant lot and he wants the Victorian and he's bringing a truck down the street to put underneath and move it down, then it's the personal property of the guy down the street, right? But if I jacked it up to fix the foundation and I had no intention of severing it from the land, it's still real property. How about this? I haven't jacked it up yet. It's still sitting on the foundation, but I sold the structure to the guy down the street, giving him the right to come and move it away. Is it real or personal property? Personal. It's the personal property of another person. So now wait a second. A house that's not on the foundation can be real property, and a house on the foundation can be personal property. Huh? Right, do you understand? This is clear as mud, right? Because the agreement and the intention is more important than the method of attachment. A fun example, a woman sold a house, and in her house she had a pipe organ built into the wall, right? I bet you it was a lot of fun around Halloween, right? You know, with the pipe organ. And so what's bizarre about this case is, so she sells the house, the buyer moves in and she removes the pipe organ, right? She took it with her. She repaired the wall and repainted it. You couldn't even tell that it had been there. And this is the part that I find fascinating. The buyer sued her, wanting the pipe organ back. Now, the pipe organ was built into the wall. Is that real or personal property? Pipe organ built into the wall, real or personal property? Now I can see we don't have a consensus. It's the court ruled personal property. It's a musical instrument. If it had been a baby grand piano, would you have been arguing that she couldn't take it with her? The fact that her musical instrument is of the type that it has to be bolted down to be used doesn't change the fact that it's a musical instrument. Right? Now, if it had been a church, the court sort of blathered about this. If it had been a pipe organ in a church, they might have considered it to be something that would have been intended to be used with the real property and would stay there. But a pipe organ in a house is just a neighborhood nuisance, right? You understand? And that would be, do you understand how unclear this could be? What are you getting the sense that maybe we ought to write it down? Right? You sort of getting the sense? Maybe you ought to write it down. I sold a townhouse once, and the owner had this beautiful wooden candelabra. It went up against the wall, had little, driftwood pieces that went out, and a whole bunch of candles, and a couple of bolts to hold it to the wall so it didn't fall over. Buyer moves in, it's gone. Right? It's gone. So the buyer's complaining that you took our candelabra. I said, no, it's not yours. It's a decoration. Right? You understand? And that's why I said to the agent, if it had been an original Van Gogh, which they had bolted to the wall so no one could steal it, would you have expected to get that? Right? You don't get decorations. The guy tried to argue that it was a lighting fixture, candles, right? And I said, yeah, sure, right? You understand that having it written down would be the most logical thing to do, because the rest of this is an argument. On the state exam, the most common thing they're going to ask you when they ask about this is what's not a test? What's not a test? And so they're going to give you 4 choices, 3 of which have pieces of Maria, and the 4th one will be not Maria. And I've written in the most common one: size of the item is not a test, cost is not a test, and the time we attached it, those are not tests. But you need to know Maria. The relationship of the parties, emblements, growing crops. Apples on an apple tree. Are they real or personal property? The apple, there's an apple orchard, there's apples on the tree. Are the apples real property or personal property? Real property. The apples are connected to the branch, and the branch is connected to the trunk, and the trunk is in the ground. It's part of the... If you pick the apples and put them in a basket, they're personal property. But when they're on the tree, they're part of the tree. And the tree, well, you already went through the tree thing. So right. So could a farmer sell his apples before harvest? Yes. Well, I think that's the whole idea, by the way, if you're a farmer, to sell them before you harvest them. Are those still real property apples, or are they the personal property of someone else? Personal property of someone else. Could a farmer borrow money against the apples before he's harvested? What do farmers have to borrow against the next harvest? So he gets a loan against the apples. Now that loan allows the creditor to come and remove the apples if he cannot pay. Are those apples still real property apples, or are they now movable apples by law because of the lien that was created? They're movable apples and personal property. And to throw it in, if the apples are being cultivated by a tenant farmer, under California law, which comes from English common law, the apples are the personal property of the tenant. And the tenant even has the right to come in for the last harvest, even though the lease is expired. Can you tell by looking at the apple whether or not it's a real or personal property apple? Can you tell by looking at that? No? You have a question? Or?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So what if a land it's going through a situation by a court because they're fighting for it between a wife and a brother-in-law because the husband died for whatever reason,
right,
and the wife sells the fruit to someone already, whatever who the person is. They give her the money, but they haven't harvested
that question is a little bit more than we're going to get into, because it would depend upon if somebody died and somebody inherited it, what was the nature of that estate.
So my question is, what will happen if that person that doesn't belong the fruit anymore steals the fruit and the buyer?
Well, if somebody steals your fruit, you can have them arrested if you can prove that it was, in fact, something they didn't have the right to. You could sue them civilly. But sometimes getting involved in when somebody dies, what happens is sort of difficult, right? But we're going to Emblements is a fancy word that refers to growing crops, cultivated crops. Notice it says they're considered real property between buyer and seller, personal property between landlord and tenant, and when cut, mortgaged, or sold, become personal property. Is it easy to tell if something is real or personal? Not very easy, right? Because you can't tell by looking at the apple. Trade fixtures are an exception. So let's say it's merry, or they weren't actually that merry in Old England, but anyhow, Old England, I'm a carpenter and I'm renting a stall down by the market. So, and I have like a 5-year lease on this little space, and I do my carpentry there. I make things, I carpenter things, right? And my 5 years is up, and my lease is up, and I'm leaving my little stall, and I'm putting all my carpenter tools in a box, and the landlord shows up and he says, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, my lease is up, and so I'm leaving, and I'm gathering all my tools, and I'm going, and the landlord says, well, you can't take those tools with you. Those tools have been on my land for the last 5 years. They belong to me now. Does that make any sense? Right? It doesn't make any sense at all. Well, the next stall over is a blacksmith. The difference between the two of us is that the blacksmith's tools are different than mine. The blacksmith has a hearth and he has an anvil and he's got tools that actually have to be built in order to be used. Now, if it doesn't make sense to give the landlord the carpenter's tools, then it also shouldn't make sense to give the landlord the blacksmith's tools, because tools are tools. Right? You see the exception here. Tools that are installed to be used in a trade or business are considered the personal property of the tenant, no matter how they're attached. And the tenant can take them as long as they repair the damage. Articles of personal property that a tenant is attached to real property necessary in a trade or business. On the exam, one of the questions is about business office equipment. And I couldn't find any really compelling pictures, so I threw in a barber chair as just an example. Do you understand? Sometimes those things are on the ground, right? How about printing presses? Sometimes they're bolted down, right? Does that mean that they now belong to the landlord? No, you can take them, but you might have to fix the holes in the floor. They can be removed by the tenant if there's no damage. Not considered real property. Trade fixtures are an exception to the fixture rule. Trade fixtures are not considered to be real property. More about fixtures. Real property can become personal property and vice versa. Remember the trees and the logs and remember all that stuff. That's an example of that. A fixed personal property should not be removed without the consent of all parties. You shouldn't start tearing things away, especially if you're a tenant, without talking to the landlord also. We've come to the third thing that constitutes real property. It's called an appurtenance. And an appurtenance is something that pertains to the use of the land. It pertains to the use of the land. It's considered to be real property. It's used for the benefit. Notice it says run with the land. That's sort of a weird thing. Run with the land means it goes wherever the land goes, which means that you do not have to mention it in a deed or contract. No separate contract is needed to convey it. So if I have something that's an appurtenance, I don't need to mention it in the contract. I don't need a separate contract. It automatically goes to the new owner. Examples are easements, which we're going to talk about next week. Stock in a mutual water company, which is the fun one, which we're going to talk about now. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions. So if I buy a condo in a homeowner association, all of that good stuff like covenants, conditions, and restrictions go with the land, right? Where whoever owns it gets that too. Minerals, water courses, streams, dwelling, fences, they all run with the land. We don't need a separate contract for the house and another one for the land, right? We just have one contract for the whole thing. The fun one is stock in a mutual water company. So let's say there's a subdivision that's put out in the boondocks and there's no city water. So what happens is they have a water company and the water company has a pumping station, and maybe that's a little water tower. So if I buy this lot, the one marked X, up in that subdivision, I get a deed to the property, but in addition to the deed, I get stock in a mutual water company. And that stock in the water company gives me continual access to the water. Could I sell my lot to the brother-in-law I don't like, but not the stock in the water company? Right? Could I just sell him the lot, not mention anything about keep the water company stock for myself, and then I could say to him afterwards, oh, you wanted water too? You should have said something, right? Will they let me do that? And the answer is no, because the stock, remember real properties, land, fixtures, and appurtenances, that stock in the mutual water company, which gives the owner of the land access to water, is an appurtenance. It is immovable by law. It cannot be separated from the ownership of the land, and it is always real property. If you're taking the state exam and they have a question about which of the following is real property, and one of the choices is stock in a mutual water company, pick it. I don't care how convincing the other choices sound, it's always real property. Stock in a company can be real property. Huh? Is that what we're saying? Stock in a company can be real property. If it's a mutual water company and that stock gives access to the water, it's an appurtenance, and an appurtenance is part of the real property. By the way, up in the Los Gatos Mountains, there's mutual water companies, right? They're not that far away. And also the Bureau of Real Estate loves to ask about this on the test because it seems kind of bizarre. Estates, how long is it owned? How long? That seems weird. I'll explain that. An estate refers to rights or interests that are or could become possessory. Possessory means you have the right to possess and use it. You could live there, you could farm it. That's what possession means. Live there or farm it, or possession, cattle. The degree, quantity, nature, and extent of interest which a person has in property. How big is your bundle? Remember that? That determines your estate. You can have more than one on the same property at the same time. I wrote them out here, although it may not make any sense to you. I'll mention it later when we get to those. And there's two kinds of estate, freehold and less than freehold. Do I have a diagram? Yeah, why not? So, by the way, just before I get to that, by the words freehold, we don't mean that it was free. It means that if you're the owner, you have a freehold. This all comes from England. And in England, there was a feudal system. And the way the feudal system worked is that there was usually a big hill and a castle on the hill. And the person that lived in the castle on the hill owned all the land around. Entire towns and villages were all owned by the guy in the castle, and because he was the title owner, Lord somebody or other, he had a free hold of the land. Everyone else was a tenant, and they were less than free, right? They did not have a free ownership. They were less than free, hence those words. So interests can be divided into present interests and future interests. This will be fun. Present interest means you have the right to possess and use it now. Future means, well, you have the right to possess and use it in the future. Present interest can be free or non-free, or less than free. That took up too much room, so I said non-free. And freehold refers to title, and non-freehold refers to leases, tenants. Freehold, then there's two kinds of future interests, a reversion and a remainder. And under freehold, there's a fee estate and a life estate, and there are 4 kinds of less than freehold estates and 2 kinds of fee estates, and that chart represents all the interests that you need to know, right? And unfortunately, we're going to talk about all of them, right? So, to start with the concept, what's the difference between free and less than free? Free also means it's indefinite. If you own a house, how long do you own it for? Who knows? Until you sell it? Until you die? It's indefinite. If you rent or lease, it's not indefinite. You may or may not know this, but our law regulates how long a lease can be for. And we'll get to that, but they ask questions about agricultural land, and the law limits an agricultural lease to 51 years. Do you understand? It's definite how long the lease is for. It can't go on forever. If it does, it's not a lease. But freehold are indefinite ownerships. You can leave it to your children, they go on forever. And there's two kinds, the life and the fee estate, which we're going to talk about. So freehold estates, there's the fee estate, also known as the fee simple, and the life estate. Now the word fee does not unfortunately mean that you paid a fee. This would make it too simple. It comes from English feudal times. So the guy, remember the guy in the castle? He was said to have his own little fiefdom. He was a fief of the king. How did you become a fief of the king? Well, when the king fought a war, you got some guys together and you showed up and helped. All right, that was the bottom line. And then you get your own little castle and your own little fiefdom. Now, people have sometimes said to me, well, does the word fee mean you paid a fee? And the answer is yes, it also means that too. If you want to understand the structure of the feudal system, watch The Sopranos again, right? You know, just because, you know, the guy, if you know The Sopranos, right? There's the head guys in New York, right? And then the guys in New Jersey have to kick money up to the guys in New York. Isn't that right? Right? And then the guy in New Jersey has his own little crew and they kick money to him. Isn't that right? And then he kicks money. You get the system. That's the system. So the tenants, the guy in the castle didn't work, but all the land was rented out to people who did. They paid rent, a fee. He took a cut and passed it on to the king, right? And everybody was happy. Isn't that? So it's a fee. And by the way, when I go through this, a lot of times somebody will raise their hand, and I'm just trying to save time. And what they'll ask me is, well, I have like a condominium, and which of these do I have? And the answer is you undoubtedly have a fee simple estate. What's called a fee simple absolute. That's what you've got. Just thought I would share that with you. A life estate is not inheritable. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's two kinds of fee estates, the absolute fee, which is what you have if you own a house, and the defeasible fee, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So freehold endures for a period not fixed or specified. We don't know when it's going to end. See all these words next to fee simple, fee, estate and fee, perpetual estate, and state of inheritance, and freehold. Unfortunately, you need to know that all those words refer to the same thing and are used on the state exam. Just saying, you need to know that all those words are talking about the same thing, and they all are used on the state exam. It's indefinite and can be conveyed during life or upon death. You can leave it to your kids if you want to. It could have encumbrances. Just because I have a freehold does not mean I don't owe money. It doesn't mean there aren't any property taxes. It doesn't mean that there isn't a mortgage on it. It doesn't mean that there aren't roads and easements and all this other stuff, right? But I have a freehold in my title. The fee simple absolute is what most people have. There's no qualifications, the greatest degree of ownership, indefinite in duration. If you don't have any liens on your property, no mortgages and things like that, you're said to have clear title, which is a different subject. We'll repeat this when we get to title insurance later. Then there's the fee simple defeasible, and defeasible means defeatable. It's got a condition. I'll give you an example. Let's say I go to church and, you know, they've been complaining. They have a new minister, and they always keep complaining that the new minister doesn't have a nice place to live, right? Every Sunday they're saying, gee, the minister, we don't have a nice place for the minister to live, and I've got an extra house, so I decide I'm going to donate a house to the church. But I do so on the condition they use it as the minister's residence, right? Can I do that? Sure, why not? I donate a house to the church on the condition that the church uses it as the minister's residence. Could the church always own that house? Is it possible? They could always, well, they always got a minister in it, right? They could always own the house. But if I find out in a couple of years that the minister's moved out to a newer, bigger, better house, and the house I gave the church they're using for their bunco parties, I can get the house back. Does everybody understand that's a defeatable fee? It's got a condition. Does everybody see that? That's different. The absolute doesn't have one of these. But this is what's called a condition subsequent. It says the owner's title is defeated if the condition is broken. On the exam, the question that they ask is about a guy who sold property on the condition that it not be used for the sale of alcoholic beverages. Sold property with a condition that it not be used for the sale of alcoholic beverages, and the test says what kind of an estate does the buyer have? And the answer is a fee simple defeasible. Then there's a life estate, and when we finish this, we'll take a break. Is that okay? Because some of you look like you're losing life right now, so I thought the life estate, this is sort of fun. It's a bit morbid, however, a bit morbid. It says it's a life. It's limited in duration to the life or lives or one or more designated persons. How about this? It's an estate that has a clock.
Should we copy?
Yes. Several people online said yes too. All right. So there's a clock. And as long as the clock ticking the estate is good, and when the clock stops ticking, the estate changes, ends, and moves. Now, what makes this a little bit unsavory is that the clock is a person. It's a person. So, I'll give you the most common, this does not come up all the time, but I'll give you the most common example of the way it's used today. Let's say I graduate from a college and I want to leave them my house because I owe everything to the college that I went to. The problem is, so what I could do, first of all, I don't want to move right now. I don't want to move. And I'd like to get a tax deduction for making a charitable donation. Let's say it's a church, house, something like that I want to give my house to. I want to get the tax deduction now, but I don't want to move now. What I can do is give the church or the university my house, but keep a life estate, which basically says they have the future interest, but as long as I'm alive, I get it. Right? Do you understand? So I get a tax deduction now. I don't have to move. And when I die, it goes to them. But I actually deed the property to them today, but I reserve a life estate. Right? Doesn't come up all the time. So the holder of the life estate, who's called the life tenant, has the right to possess and use, cannot allow waste. That means they have to pay property taxes and keep the property maintained. Now remember that in the example, I gave it to the church, but I reserved a life estate. Could I sell my life estate to somebody? And the answer is yes, if I can convince them to buy it, right? Because what happens when I die? It goes to the church. Could I say, gee, I'm tired of living here. I want to move and lease the property that I have. Could I sign a 10-year lease? Sure, why not? What happens if I die? It goes to the church, right? You understand? So I can sell it, I can borrow money against it, I can lease it, but only for as long as I'm alive. And when I die, it's terminated and moves on. I have an estate in property. I have what's called a life estate. All right? The other people have what's called a future interest. I cannot will it because when I die, it goes on to somebody else. Unless it's based on another's life. This is fun. Okay, we're going to go through the two examples that you're likely to see on the state exam. Yeah.
Something on the last slide that cannot allow waste.
Waste means you cannot trash the place. You have to pay property taxes. You have to maintain the property. Because somebody has a future interest. Okay, let's go through this, and then we'll be really through. A deeds to B for B's life, then back to A. So why would I do this? Well, let's say I have a widowed mother, and she needs a house. Now, I could just give her the house because I'm sure she would give it back to me in her will, right? I mean, I'm sure she would. I mean, it's true she always liked my older brother better, but I'm sure, you know, she has trouble remembering, you know, where she put her shoes, but I'm sure she will remember that I'm the one that gave her the house and leave it to me in the will. Isn't that right? Right? I'm sure of that. I mean, she certainly wouldn't remarry or anything, would she? I mean, she does go on these trips with some guy from the you know, but I'm sure she won't remarry and give him the house. I mean, you know, wait a second, those trips, they go to the Indian casinos. I mean, I'm sure she would never bet the house, would she? You don't think she'd do that. She wouldn't double down once too often at the roulette. Do you understand? I might not ever get the house back. Do you understand the problem? I give her the house, I might not ever get it back. So I deed her the house for her life. And when she dies, it immediately and automatically reverts back to me. You see, understand why you might do this. I'm the grantor, I'm the one that created the mess, and I have a future interest, the estate in reversion, then back to A. B, the widow, the mother is the life tenant and the measuring life. Wouldn't it be great to be called the measuring life? Doesn't that sound, it's a little better than the clock. So how about this second scenario? A deeds to B for the life of C and then the remainder to D. So I'm not going to deed the house to the widowed mother because I know she's not going to take care of it. So I'm deeding to Aunt Mabel, right? A deeds to B. B is Aunt Mabel, who's taken care of Mom for as long as Mom's alive. Now, do you understand that there's a little bit of an incentive here for Aunt Mabel to keep Mom in good shape, right? You understand? She'll be giving her vitamins every day, taking her for walks, all that sort of stuff, because Mabel doesn't own the house unless Mom's alive. And then when Mom passes, I don't want it back. It can go to my nephew, George. Does everybody understand? A deeds to B, but for the life of C, then to someone else. Now, do I have an interest in the property? I'm A. Do I have an interest in the property? No. No, I have a memory, right? You know, that's all I got, because A deeded to B for the life of C and then to D. I don't have a future interest. I'm out of it. Does B have an interest in the property? A deeds to B. B is the life tenant. Does C have an interest in the property? No, C's the clock, right? You know, right? That's all. Right? Doesn't have an interest in the property, sees the measuring life. Does D have an interest in the property? A future interest, right? So the two kinds of future interests are either reversion when it comes back, or a remainder is when it goes on to someone else. More about life estates. I already did this, an estate in reversion, an estate in remainder. Now, this third bullet, I'm going to go back to this fun diagram. Look at the second one, A deeds to B for the life of C. Look at that one for a second. What happens if B dies, but C is still alive and ticking? Could B's heirs inherit the life estate? And the answer is yes. So as it says here at the bottom, if the holder of the life estate, life tenant, A deeds to B, dies before the designated person, C, the property goes to the heirs of the life tenant until the death of the designated person. So in a weird way, it's possible to inherit a life estate as long as the measuring life is not the life tenant and the measuring life is still alive and ticking. And with that, we'll take a 7-minute break. How about that?